Hello there, LDS music enthusiasts. Can music harmony provide a sense of peace? As we look at the new LDS hymn number 1003, It Is Well With My Soul, we're going to see if music can, in fact, provide a sense of peace. As you may know, this is a very popular hymn throughout Christianity. I am personally really glad we've now included it in our hymnal. It's a universally loved hymn, probably because it comes from a story we can all kind of identify with, a story of extreme difficulty which we all face in mortality. The words of this hymn were composed by American hymnist Horatio Spafford. He wrote this hymn after an extremely difficult time in his life. He sent his wife and his 4 daughters on a ship to England in 1873 and planned to follow them a few days later after attending to some business concerns back in Chicago. But while crossing the Atlantic, the ship sank, and all 4 of his daughters died. His wife, Anna, thankfully survived, and she sent him this very sad telegram that said, "Saved alone," meaning the girls were gone. It was during this terrible tragedy, after he found his way over to England a few days later, when he wrote the beautiful words of this hymn. The first stanza reads, "When peace like a river attendeth my way, when sorrows like sea billows roll, whatever my lot, thou hast taught me to know, it is well with my soul." I think the second verse is my favorite. "Though Satan should buffet, though trials should come, let this blessed assurance control, that Christ hath regarded my helpless estate, and hath shed his own blood for my soul." Well, let's now turn to the music itself. How does the composer Philip Bliss provide healing feelings in a harrowing situation like this? To find out, I'm going to highlight 5 techniques that helped him create this lovely music. Technique number 1, how pedal tones produce heightened emotions. Here we are at the very beginning of It Is Well With My Soul. And as you can see, the bass line throughout this whole first line is on the same note, the C. However, as you can also see, we have different chords happening above the C and coming back. Now, we've seen this in a couple selections already in the hymnal, but It Is Well With My Soul takes this pedal point idea a little further by adding this second chord of the piece, the augmented chord. So we start with C major, we're in the key of C major, so we get our 1 chord. And then the 1 chord, the G moves up to G sharp, and then to A, and then to B, G, G. So that tenor part, we get that nice motion from the G up to G sharp. That G sharp creates this augmented triad, meaning a normal triad. You take the 5th, you raise it a half step. Oh, now it's much more than a normal major triad. It's got this yearning sense of it must go up. Needs to go there afterwards, right? It's gotta go up. But that's what we call a harrowing kind of sound in music. This is something the great composers like Bach and others used when they wanted to create a yearning or an ouch or some kind of harrowing emotion. When they wanted to create a sense of sorrow, they'd usually lower something because it gives the sad sigh. But in this case, we're heightening the emotions with an augmented chord. So we get the normal 1 chord, we get the augmented 1 chord, then we get the 4 chord over C, then we get a 5 chord, then a 5-7 chord, all over C, and then back to 1. Maybe I'm overthinking this, but when I do something like this, I think of that pedal point C as the stillness and the steadiness of the Savior. When I write in a context like this, a spiritual context, we're talking about peace like a river, where does this peace come from? Of course, it comes from the Savior. And so to have this pedal at the bottom, it's like it provides this constance, this never-ending steadiness as the chords above are like the vicissitudes of life that get buffeted and move us around through challenges. But beneath it all, there's the Savior, steady, the rock, always there for us. That is technique number 1. Technique 2, smoothest chord connections of all. I want to point out a really crucial point when writing beautiful church music, really any kind of music. There's lots of types of ways to connect chords, to go from one chord to the next. You can have a very abrupt change with lots of jumping between chords, but that's not very smooth. Now, there may be musical contexts where you don't want to be smooth at all. But in a piece like this, we want to have a sense of cohesion, a sense of smoothness to depict the emotion we're going for. And the composer, Philip Bliss, and the arranger, which I don't know who that is, but it says at the bottom of the hymn that it was arranged recently in 2024, assuming by someone at the church. They have used the best, smoothest kinds of connections between chords. And I want to point this out. So here's the 3 basic rules. When you're connecting one chord to the next, you're thinking horizontally. So when you take a note from one chord and you go to the next chord, you think, okay, if I'm the alto, my first choice would be to keep a common tone. Common tones from one chord to the next tether a chord to another chord in the smoothest way possible because they haven't moved. There's no motion at all. It's a common tone. That's extremely smooth writing. It's about as smooth as you can possibly get. If for some reason you can't keep a common tone because maybe that note doesn't fit the next chord or something like that, then your next best option for smooth connections would be to step to the nearest chord tone, always trying to avoid any kind of errors or strange sounds. And if you can't step, then you consider leaping to the next nearest chord tone. Now, there are reasons to not go to the next nearest chord tone sometimes, and we're going to see one of those coming up soon. But the point is, we want to create smooth connections as much as possible. And in several places, that's what's happening here. So here's a good example on the words my way. The tenor, we're going from a G7 over C to a C chord. If you can keep a common tone, do so. We did. These can't be common, but look at they step in this way that resolves perfectly. Now, going to the very next chord, which is down here, look at the tenor note. Again, it's G. So the G continues and connects to this chord as a nice common tone tether from one chord to the next. Now, let's take it to the A minor 7. It connects again, common tone, from the 5-6 chord, the G major chord in first inversion, to the A minor 7 chord. Now that 7th wouldn't be there if it didn't have the G, because 7ths like to get prepared, and we prepared it here by presenting that note right before and having it suspend over as a common tone. And you can see several other places in this piece where we have common tones. Like here, the common tone carries over from this chord to this chord. These are 2 common tones that carry over, and it happens again and again. Here's another example, common tone carrying over. Those common tone connectors are so good. There's a similar concept in writing called reasoning connections, where you write a sentence in an essay or in a blog post or whatever, and you want to connect the next sentence to the sentence that came before. Often to do that, you repeat a word that came from the previous sentence in the next sentence, or at least the meaning of an idea from the previous sentence to the next sentence. That creates a common thread from sentence to sentence and makes for very smooth reading. That's the equivalent of these kinds of smooth common tones. An excellent technique to keep your music very cohesive and very smooth. Technique 3, mighty tenor ministering. Here we are in measure 5. Now, as we talked about in the previous video, we have just come from a very smooth connecting thread through our tenors on repeated common tone on the note G. But now we have something much different. We have a huge leap from the G down here all the way up to the D. Now that's a big leap, and it's an upward leap, and it's taking the tenors from their mid register to their higher register, which, by the way, can be somewhat dangerous. Like Richard Strauss said about trombones, don't look at the trombones, it only encourages them. This is very true often for tenors. So ward choir directors, be careful. Don't look at the tenors, it only encourages them. And us tenors sometimes have a tendency to be overly heroic and stick out like a sore thumb because we like the attention. But in this particular spot of this hymn, we have this very big kind of heroic leap from the G all the way up to the C. Now, as we've talked about in other videos, it's important when you take the bigger the leap you take, it's best to step in the opposite direction, which happens here. But there's something else going on. We're on this A minor 7 chord, and the melody is way up here on C, and it's going to step down. Now, it's stepping through a B, which does not belong to the chord. This chord is spelled A, C, E, G. There's no B's in this chord. But we're passing through the B on our way from C to A. So we call it a passing tone, a marked PT. Well, the tenor doesn't want to let the soprano have all the fun, because by passing through that B, it adds a certain kind of sound. It's a different sound. It's a dissonance, in fact. And those dissonances, which create tension, is where the emotion in music happens. It's the tension and the release of the tension that causes those emotional ooh moments, okay? So the soprano's creating a bit of a little moment by going to this kind of expressive B as it steps down to A, but the tenor is going to join. It's going to do it in a beautiful interval with the soprano. See, if you take the D and compare it to the B, that's a sixth. So it's going to go D to B, sixth, and step down, C to A, and sixth. That's a beautiful interval that we use a lot. So it's going to take the G, and it's going to go way up here to play the B, and then down. It's a very expressive move. So I find that this is being done for two reasons. One, to harmonize the move to the B with a sixth below it, and then to continue harmonizing down to the A in the soprano with the C below it, but also to have a moment of high expression. Because when a note that fits a chord jumps to a note that doesn't fit the chord, we call this an appoggiatura, it creates another tension, a tension that wants to resolve. And that's why it should step down, because that's what resolves the tension. The leap and the step. So listen to how this happens. It adds to this feel that we're going for. And on the word sorrows, when sorrows like sea billows roll, of all the lines in this whole piece, that's probably the one he was thinking about his daughters the most. So to have on sorrows this appoggiatura adding extra tension, it's a great choice. Very powerful technique. Technique 4, drawing poison from wounds with non-chord tones. A non-chord tone is a note that doesn't fit the chord, a note that creates a tension and then gets resolved. We've seen a few of these already in this piece, the appoggiatura and the passing tone that we looked at just a moment ago. But now we're going to look at the suspensions. There are 7 suspensions in this pretty short hymn. And I think that they're there for a very particular reason, to get that kind of feel, like what I'm calling this poison drawing out of the wound kind of a feel. It feels that way to me because suspensions are built on common tones, Remember a bit ago we talked about how common tones between chords are the smoothest kind of writing? Well, this is taking common tones to the next level. A suspension is where you have a common tone from one chord to the next, but when it repeats, it's now a dissonance because it doesn't fit the chord, and then you step down to a note that does fit the chord. This happens 7 times in this piece. I've marked them all in blue here. So when sorrows, now the E in the alto is going to carry over. E doesn't fit the chord. D fits the chord. Now look at the tenor. The tenor is going to carry over the C, which does not belong, and it resolves to the B. Now it does belong. Now continuing on. Now look at the alto. To the next chord, the alto stays there and then resolves. Now we're going to get pretty soon another one. The alto, then it carries over, suspension, resolves. And now the soprano is going to carry over to the next line where it doesn't fit and then resolves. And then that happens again at the end. The alto is well. You see the common tone carried over, and then it steps down to where it does belong. And then the soprano does the same. Is well, it doesn't fit, but it got there by common tone and steps down. That is what a suspension does. It pulls that note from the previous chord over by repeating it. It doesn't fit the chord, and then it steps down. Well, we have 2 other similar things that happen, which I've marked in purple, that are kind of a backwards suspension. In other words, the suspension resolves after the new chord. Well, we have something called an anticipation, which is where a note that doesn't fit the chord is resolving too early. So look here on Well With My Soul there in measure 13. If you look at the soprano, the B fits the chord, but then the C on My, it doesn't fit. It's too early. It doesn't belong until Sol. But it sounds beautiful. Anticipations, they get there a little too soon. Ooh, but it creates a nice tension, and the resolution of that tension is a common tone. So again, these common tones, oh man, do they win. Common tones can be used in so many powerful ways. And we're going to see one more way here in just a second in technique number 5. Technique 5, monotone melody transforms into sumptuous sounds. All right, at the very beginning of the chorus, we return to the first technique that we saw at the very beginning of the hymn, which was those pedal tones. So we start the hymn, as you can see, with those pedal C's on It Is Well With My Soul. Above it, again, we're moving from the 1 chord to the 4 chord to the 5 chord. But this time we have a little addition, and we get that addition, as I just mentioned, by common tone. So look here at the very beginning of the chorus in blue, we have It Is Well. Okay, now that G in the C chord, that's just the 5th of the chord, root 3rd, 5th. But now we're going to go to a F major chord, which is the 4 chord. But guess what? There's no G's in an F chord. The F chord is F, A, C, 4 chord. So we have a 4 chord with C in the bass, but we kept the melody on the G. It is well. But that note doesn't fit the chord. So what note is it? It's a 9th. Sometimes we get these chords where we have a triad and we have an extra color note. These color notes, they're not non-chord tones. Non-chord tones resolve. This doesn't resolve anywhere. It's part of the chord. It's a color tone, like a 7th 9th, 11th, 13th. If you've ever heard any music by Debussy, French composers, or in jazz, there's lots of these extra color tones. What's unique about this one is we don't just jump to a chord that has a 9th on it. We get to that 9th in the melody. The melody note itself is the color tone. Usually we find a color tone somewhere else in the chord, and we get to that 9th not by leaping, but by common tone repetition. 9th. That's such a beautiful way to get to a 9th, to use the melody note. We don't often think of that melody note being a color tone, but it can be, and it can be done beautifully. And in this particular case, extremely smoothly because, again, common tone. So if in case you missed that in this video, I think the theme was common tones. They can do all sorts of wonders for you. So to wrap up, what's my opinion of this hymn? Not only is it a keeper in my mind, but so far it's my favorite addition to the hymnal. It's a hymn that really speaks to the kinds of challenges and difficulties we all have in life. I think this will do a lot of good in our worship services for many years to come. And even though the harmonization is different than you'll find in most hymnals, I think they've done a really good job with this one. Some may not like it as much because they're used to the old one, and that's fine. You can probably use the old one as an alternate harmonization, maybe for the final verse of your hymn in your sacrament meeting. Fair game. But it's a beautiful one, and they've done a great job of creating that sense of connection and the sense of peace in this version of the hymn. I quite like it. If you'd like to download my complete harmonic analysis of this song, I've dropped the link below this video in the description. And if you'd like to get some additional free resources to help you write your own beautiful sacrament meeting music, there are additional resources down in the box below. Be sure to watch the next video in our series of new LDS hymn reviews. In the next video, I'll review what has become a favorite primary song for many, I Will Walk with Jesus. I'll see you then.